first and second year. And at that time, 25% of us were already married. By graduation, 30% of us had been married, so I guess some people had more to do during intern summer between years and 2% were already divorced. Skip forward 25 years, and now only 5% of us have never been married. That is less than half of what you would expect based on our age. If you think that's unusual, what's really unusual is that the men in our class are even less likely to have never been married. Only 3.5% of the men in our class have never been married. Number one, that is about a fifth of what you'd expect based on our age. And number two, it compares to 11% of the women in our class, which is exactly average for women already. So the women seem normal and well-adjusted. But there is something very insecure or very romantic, depending on your perspective, about the men in our class. Another perspective on what 3.5% of the men compares to is that based on the 1986 poll, 1.2% of our class self-identified as gay, and 1.0% self-identified as asexual or other. And I don't know what harvest meant when they asked the question, and I definitely don't know what people meant when they answered the question. But of the 3.5% of the men who've never been married, we are right down to the very limit of the men who want to be married to a woman. So our next slide will be about Sanjeev. And then the final piece of perspective on men versus women is that according to the 2010 U.S. Census, men in their 50s are 50% more likely to be never married than women in America. And our class is just the opposite. Our men are less than 1/3% as likely to be not married. Not only do we like to get married, but we get married early. The mean age for first marriage for people of our age is 26, but it skews very rapidly based on education. So considering that everybody in this room at least has a master's degree from a reputable institution of postgraduate education, we got married very early. The median age at first marriage is 29, and by 31, 65% of us were already married, and by 40, 89% were married. Sanjeev, we had a good laugh at your expense. Fast forward 25 years. What is your current marital status? 79% are still married. You can see the number of people in our class who are divorced is 9%. We'll come back to that in 1 second. 5% were divorced and remarried, the triumph of hope over experience. And not 1%, but one classmate has availed ourselves of the slowly evolving legal definitions of our marriage code. The conclusion you can draw from this class is that our class, for whatever we from this section, our class, that's the romantic analysis of it. Statistically, our class is way, way under-divorced. Now, how do we know that? Because obviously divorce is driven in large part by education and financial status, so it's difficult to compare us to national norms. So I have 2 points of comparison I was able to find. Number one, 14% of our class has been divorced at least once. The class ahead of us, the class of 85, 20% of those people of that class was divorced as of their reunion last year. So that's 50% higher than we are. And if you really want to blow your mind, I found a survey for the class of 1970. So they are obviously 15 years ahead of us, so they've obviously had 15 more years to get divorced. But who wants to venture a guess on what percentage of the class of 1970 has been divorced?
Everybody got divorced.
Thank you for your precise and quantitative answer. No, the answer is not everybody. The answer is 42%.
Whoa.
So although they are...
So we had something to look forward to.
Exactly.
Very entertaining.
Now they have triple the divorce rate that we have, which says one of two things. One, that Bruce is right, that the next 15 years are going to be ugly. Or two, that we're actually pretty good at choosing our partners. And unlike Bruce's cynicism, I like to believe...
divorce and remarried category.
All right, so I guess you can speak with confidence. The reason I think we're actually better at choosing our spouses than the class of 1970 is 14% of us have been divorced at least once. In contrast, in the class of 1970, 13.2%, almost exactly the same percentage, had a marriage that lasted less than 5 months. Wow. So
That's the hippie generation. It was the 60s. It was the 60s.
So the next time you have a fight with your spouse, you can at least console yourself that you've made it past 5 months. All right, so we like to get married and we like to stay married. How do we get married? Here are how people met their spouses. These are the big four answers that explain a majority of the class. First of all, it's very, very important to develop a good network of friends, because the chances are high that they're going to introduce you to your spouse. 21% of the class met their spouse through their friends. Also, make sure you choose your college wisely. 20% chance that that's what you're going to be like. HBS, well, all right, we all got it. And then finally, where you work is important, because 12% of the class met their spouse at work. 10% who had no supporting relationship with their soon-to-be spouse, and the other 2%. That is an HR action. The next four answers, well, let's call part one. They were setups of some sort, whether by friends, college, or business school admissions officers, employees. Part two are the responses from classmates who just went for it. 6% met their spouses at a party, 4% in a random meeting, such as a plane or a taxi, 3% met at a bar, and 3% weren't even willing to just trust their fates to serendipity. They said, I am going to be proactive and pay somebody to introduce me to my spouse, and they were successful. And the final three answers, the first part one group, setup group, was 68% of the answers. The part two classmates were 16%, and I'm pleased to say that the part three people bring the class back to respectability. They were introduced either by their family, the club that they belong to, or best of all, they were members of the same church. After we get married, we like to crank out the kids. 90% of us have at least one child, and you can see that the number ramps up pretty quickly. Interestingly enough, though, as much as we like to have kids, only one of us, not 1%, but only one of us reported 6 or more children. Now, how does that compare to reasonable standards? Both classes, 81 and 85, each reported 86% of their class with at least one child. So we are 1/3 less likely to be without children. But even though we had children, and a lot of them, we had fewer children than we expected. Going back to the poll that was conducted by Harvest Jews in 1986, they asked us how many children we wanted at that time. You can see the Harvest answers here. The actual answers in 2011 are there, and what turns out is that the people who wanted most kids, more than 5, basically didn't. They ended up having only, quote-unquote, 4 or 5. The largest group of people thought they wanted 2 or 3 children, but 1/9 of those people actually had fewer than 2 or 3. And twice as many people as expected had no children. Those of us who just cranked out a kid realize that, yeah, once you start having them, the disincentive factor becomes a little bit more clear than it was before. So we we married early, and we waited a little while before we had kids. The median age at the time of the first child was 31.9, which is well after we were married. But then once we had our first one, we decided to learn from our POM cases and crank out as much parallel processing as possible. We cranked them out pretty quickly. And the median time at the age of the last child was only 36 years. So we were busy in our 30s. What about grandchildren? Well, I guess we learned enough from our having children to not accelerate the process toward grandchildren. Only 7 people responded with grandchildren. So there were very few grandparents. But if you had any grandchildren, there was a pretty good chance you had a lot of them. Almost half had 5 or 6. Chapter 2, careers. Interestingly enough, for a highly educated, ambitious, high-powered group, only 72% of us still work full-time for pay. People have stopped working because they're homemakers, fully retired, semi-retired, and not surprisingly, in this economic environment, a lot of people are looking for jobs. So only 72% of people answered the following questions about their work environment. If you left the workforce, chances are pretty good you left early. The homemakers left on an average at age 37, and a lot of people seem to have done well enough in their class to check out of the rat race pretty early, at an average age of 45. And 40% of those who are still working or looking for work are already, quote unquote, thinking seriously about a retirement date. So everybody seems to be looking forward to a day on the beach. We are just as likely to work for a small or a large employer. These are the percentages by number of employees at the company. The median number of employees at an employer is exactly 100, and you'll notice that statistically we are just as likely to work for a company of 10 employees or fewer as 5,000 or more. So the distribution is all over the waterfront. There's a stereotype that people graduate from business school to manage giant organizations, and that doesn't really seem to be the case. 19% of us work in a situation where nobody reports to us. 5% only have one person reporting to them. The median number of reports is just over 10. So while 3% are in fact running what seem to be giant organizations, that is not the norm. Consistent with having a lot of smaller employers, we have a lot of owners. 12% of respondents own more than 80% of their employers. And you can see that only 24% of the class reported no ownership at all of their employer. Consistent with people working for smaller companies and being comfortable with that, the entrepreneurship itch in our class is frequently scratched. 52% of the people in the class, or the respondents, answered in the affirmative that they have at one point started their own company. Of the founders, 52% still own and work there. There's a wide range in the number of employers that people will have. 9% still have the same employer they started with. The median number of employers is 4, and we asked people how many distinct careers, as opposed to distinct jobs they've had. The median number of distinct careers is 2. The road, while exciting, often does have a bump or two, and this is a list of how many people have been involuntarily terminated and how often. Just about half the class has never been terminated, and the experience of the other half is pretty varied. All right, those are our jobs. Do we like them? 25% of the class responded, or 25% said that they were passionate enough about their job that they would do it for free. And that strikes me as reasonably high. 62% were a little bit more jaded, said, yeah, the job's interesting and satisfying, but let's not go so far as to call it my passion. And 4% said, yeah, I do it, but mainly because it's a paycheck. Lifestyles and our lives so far. Life is what happens while you're making plans.